We've talking about a number of subjects today, but the big subject to talk about is this alliance between America and Australia. And what do you think about what you've heard yesterday about this deal to build submarines?
Look, I think this is a hugely important deal for the British people and actually for many of our allies around the world, including some who aren't part of this arrangement. And the reason I say that is because this is going to create a single nuclear boat fleet that will enable us to operate in 3 oceans and with partners around the world. Look, this partnership between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom is enormously important for our whole country, but particularly for people in Barrow-in-Furness, where our submarines are built, and for all of their suppliers from places like Derby, where the Rolls-Royce engines are made. This is a fantastic deal for the United Kingdom. It's also hugely important for Australia, allowing them a nuclear-capable fleet, and it's really important for the United States, giving them a reach into various areas of the Indian Ocean and into the South Pacific that has been really important to them holding the line and protecting the international rules-based order, as it's called, which is basically that agreement between free countries to travel and trade freely.
Tom, during the leadership contest to become Prime Minister last year, you talked about China, and as did Rishi Sunak. There's been a softening of the language, hasn't there? It feels a little bit as though the Prime Minister is tiptoeing around it, calling China a challenge. But why not just call a spade a spade? They're a threat to us.
Well, look, Isabel, you raise an important point, which is China does raise many challenges, and some of those are threats and some of those are challenges. And the reality is dealing with China is going to require a whole-of-government approach. And that's why the integrated review that was published yesterday is so important. Because it doesn't just talk about the military element, and there I can, if you like, I can point to the £5 billion increase in the defence budget and the aspiration for 2.5%. I can point to the doubling of money to deal with the challenge of China, which is going to include things like language learning and making sure that officials and senior officers and so on are much more aware of what China is up to. But I can also point to any number of different areas, like the way in which the Defending Democracy Task Force that I'm lucky enough to chair has set up different ways to approach the challenge of police stations, secret police stations by the Chinese state, or indeed repression by the Chinese state of Chinese citizens here in the UK. So this is a whole-of-government approach, and the AUKUS element, the defence element that the Prime Minister was in San Diego signing, is only one aspect of it, and there's much more about this to come. So this is a whole-of-government approach. It involves education, it involves the police, it involves so many different aspects of our intelligence services that this is a huge, I'm afraid, challenge. It's true, because there are some areas where we've got to engage. We've got to engage with our eyes wide open, and this is something I've always said. We mustn't be naive. There were certainly some people who may have been in recent decades, but we can't be naive, but we do have to engage.
What about the money involved, Mr Tugendhat? Prime Minister saying £5 billion, but that's not going to come immediately. How long will that, what duration would that be spread over, for instance?
Well, the £5 billion is going to come pretty soon, actually. It's the aspiration to 2.5% is before 2030, and the reality is that's a floor, not a ceiling. So, what we're doing is we're facing the reality that the world has changed. You don't need me to tell you, Eamon, that in the last 12 months, well, just over 12 months, we've seen a change in Europe with Putin's aggression in Ukraine. We've seen increasing challenges to our NATO allies in the East, and we've seen, I'm afraid, the reality that essential partners like Australia and New Zealand are facing pressures that they simply haven't faced in years before. So this is a really very welcome increase in defence spending, but this isn't just about defence. The reality is this integrated review takes state threats against us here in the United Kingdom seriously. And you heard me only a few weeks ago talking about Iranian state threats here, and you've heard me, I'm afraid, sadly, having to talk about Russian state threats here in the United Kingdom. And so this is an integrated review that recognises not just defence, but the reality that our intelligence agencies, our police force, and indeed many others of our public services are on the front line today, even here at home.
You say it's a welcome amount of money. The MOD actually wanted 11 billion, didn't they? And with the cost of these submarines, 1.3 billion a piece, and the cost of trying to fund troops and whatever's happening on the ground with Ukraine, it actually means a real terms cut in defence, does it not?
No, I don't accept that, actually. No, and as a former army officer, you're never going to hear me arguing for less money for defence. That's certainly not a position I'm going to hold. But the reality is this deal is fantastically important for our defence capability as well, because of course making more boats, making boats for the Australian Navy, for the Royal Australian Navy, and making sure that we have boats that are entirely compatible with our US allies will reduce the cost of each boat for everyone. And that's really important. It's not just important because it's more jobs in Barrow, it's more jobs in the UK for various different suppliers, but it's cheaper boats for the Royal Navy and therefore more capability. That is hugely important, and that's why the Royal Navy supports this, and that's why everybody in defence supports this, because what we really want to see is we want to see a much greater capability for the British Armed Forces, and that means working with allies and partners, and that's why I certainly welcome this AUKUS deal, this deal between President Biden, Prime Minister Albanese and Prime Minister Sunak that was signed only a few hours ago in San Diego.
OK, Tom, but if you're the Chinese hearing this news, or you're the Russians hearing this news, how does that make them think?
Well, I can't speak for the government in Beijing. I'm afraid I'm not a communist. But the reality is that the Communist Party in China has recognized for a long time that the alliance of democracies that we have seen around the world is its greatest challenge. And that's why they're seeking to undermine us in various different ways. But it's also why standing together with allies is the best way of resisting that pressure. Now, if you look at
are they quaking in their boots? Are they quaking in the boots about this? I mean, there's always that distinction. We call them nuclear submarines. They're nuclear-powered submarines. They don't have nuclear weapons, as I understand, on board. So this announcement, would this curtail any ambition that the Chinese would have in that part of the world or the Russians would have in that part of the world?
Eamon, let's not undermine what these are. These are some of the most extraordinary attack boats the world has ever seen. These so-called hunter-killer class submarines are able to deploy hundreds and hundreds of miles subsurface and to reach many, many miles from their home bases. In fact, some of them can stay subsurface for months at a time. That gives an extraordinary capability to the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal Navy and the United States Navy to be able to deploy force and to defend our allies pretty much anywhere in the world, in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and of course in the Atlantic, should it ever be necessary. This is a fantastic capability, and having three navies working so closely together is a remarkable alliance and demonstrates a level of cooperation and trust in each other, not just for today, but for generations to come.
OK, Tom, I want to ask you about the immigration bill. Passed through its first reading in the Commons last night. The Home Secretary calling detractors of her bill lefties. But it's not just lefties, is it? 3 Conservatives, fairly senior, 2 former Cabinet members and a former Prime Minister didn't actually vote because of their concerns about the government openly admitting that the bill could well contravene human rights laws, international commitments.
Look, I think we've seen in recent years one of the most horrific trades in human beings that we've experienced for hundreds of years. It's absolutely vile to see what is done to some of the most innocent and vulnerable people in the world. And it's quite right that we focus on what's happening on our own shores, but you don't have to look very far to see that this crime is much worse. If you look at what's happening in the Sahara, even right now, and the number of people who are being murdered by human traffickers, effectively abandoned in the desert and left to die. It's absolutely horrific. If you see the number of people who are trafficked in vile ways into countries on the North African coast, or indeed, you don't need me to remind you of that horrific scene of Elan Kurdi, the young boy who washed up on the shores of Turkey. This is one of the most vile trades in human beings that the world has seen, and it's absolutely right that we do everything we can to stop it.